Hello, everyone. We're letting people join us. And as we do so, I just wanted to, as you can see, remind everyone that we are recording the session. And we'll get started here in just a moment. Okay. Great. Wonderful to see many familiar names, and welcome to all of you for joining us today. Okay, so I would like to say good afternoon to all of you. My name is Elisa Jones, and I am an assistant professor of history at the College of Charleston. And I had the pleasure of co-organizing this program along with my colleagues at Dingley. Today's event will include a lecture by our guest speaker, Dr. Destin Jenkins of Stanford University, followed by a moderated question and answer session. Since this session is being recorded, as I said, we ask that all participants stay muted throughout the program, but questions for the Q&A are more than welcome and should be typed into the chat so that we can all participate together. So on behalf of the Department of History here at the College of Charleston, I'm happy to welcome you to our second annual Black History Month lecture. Today's lecture is entitled The Bonds of Racial Inequality in Post-War America. This lecture series is a part of our department's ongoing work towards implementing its diversity and inclusion action plan, which you can find on our department's website. This year, the history department agreed to also fund a reading group to accompany the lecture, and with the support of the Urban Studies program, 2 separate groups were able to read and discuss this recent book of today's speaker, Dr. Destin Jenkins. We are thrilled that Dr. Jenkins is able to join us today, and we particularly want to thank the Center for Sustainable Development at the College of Charleston for its support of this lecture as a part of its sustainability programming. This event is co-sponsored by the Center for Sustainable Development, which provides students with the opportunities and resources to engage in our community sustainably. The center defines sustainability as the integration of social, economic, equity, and environmental systems. And addressing these issues with these 3 main pillars of sustainability equips students with valuable sustainability literacy. Where these 3 systems meet and intersect is also known as the triple bottom line of sustainability. These systems are necessary in the construction of individual, institutional, community, regional, and planetary resilience. Today's lecture, focusing on racial inequality in post-war America, highlights the critically important nature of using social, economic, and environmental systems to understand and ultimately solve 21st century problems, such as in this year's theme of sustainable cities and development. We know that inequalities in urban development impact our communities in ways that are unsustainable and unjust. So it is hoped that by participating in this event, you will have more resources to advocate for equitable and fair solutions. Thank you again to the Center for Sustainable Development and its director, Todd LeBesser. We are also pleased today to introduce Gibbs Knotts, the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And Dean Knotts, would you like to say a few words of welcome?
Thanks, Dr. Jones. It's such an honor to be here today, and I'm very excited to hear Dr. Jenkins' talk. I'm not a historian, but I've studied Southern politics for the past 20 years, and race was and continues to be a central feature in understanding the political dynamics of the region. That was true in 1862, it was true in 1962, and it remains true in 2022. I want to give a big thanks to the history department for their continuing commitment to race, equity, and inclusion. Members of this department have been real campus leaders in this vitally important area. They've shared their expertise on the Historical Review Task Force, have been leaders with the Center for the Study of Slavery, and several members of the department were featured in the recent documentary, If These Walls Could Talk, produced and directed by Michael Owens and Charissa Owens. I'm particularly appreciative of the department's October 2020 Diversity and Inclusion Plan. This plan acknowledged the historical shortcomings in its commitment to diversity and inclusion and made a commitment to transparently take concrete steps in order to support Black and other marginalized voices in the department and in its class offerings. So the plan also lists 9 commitments, including annual programming that supports the campus's activities related to Black History Month. So thanks to our audience for being here. Thanks to the History Department for your continued commitment to this important topic and for organizing this lecture. And I'll now turn things over to Dr. Dingley, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Great, thanks, Gibbs. So I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Destin Jenkins, who earned his PhD in 2016 from Stanford University, from the Department of History, where he now teaches. Before returning to Stanford as assistant professor, Dr. Jenkins held fellowships at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, the Robert L. Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School for Social Research, and at the University of Chicago, where he was also from 2018 to 2021, Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of History. 2021, last year, saw not only Dr. Jenkins's homecoming to Stanford, but the publication of 2 books. Histories of Racial Capitalism, which is a volume co-edited with Dr. Justin Leroy of UC Davis, which is a wonderfully provocative collection of essays that argue in various ways that race is not epiphenomenal or superstructural to capitalism, but rather central to its ongoing reconstitution as a contradictory form of life. And the bonds of inequality, debt and the making of the American city, with the University of Chicago Press, which many of us read over the past few weeks as part of the reading groups co-sponsored by the Department of History and Urban Studies program. It's a remarkable book that I would encourage you all to read if you haven't yet. I should also note that it was a finalist for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History's Prize for Best New Book in African American History and Culture. To say that it's a history of municipal bond markets in the Bay Area from the New Deal to the Reagan era hardly does it justice, although it is that. In the meetings of our reading group, I think that the most commonly expressed sentiment was that we all felt that we had no idea just how much we did not know about the circumscription of democratic political processes by the financialization of public funds. Dr. Jenkins' other work has appeared in the Journal of Urban History, as well as the New York Times, The Nation, and the Washington Post. And he's also a principal investigator and curator of a digital humanities project called The Business of Debt, which I know will be of interest to many of you in attendance, and which sounds completely fascinating. I'll stop there because I want to make sure that we have time for all the questions that this talk is sure to provoke. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Destin Jenkins, who will deliver the 2022 Department of History's annual Black History Month lecture entitled The Bonds of Racial Inequality in Post-War America. Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Zeb, so much. Thank you, Gibbs, Dean Knotts, for being here and kind of offering some really important context. Really thrilled to be here in light of all the efforts you just mentioned, thinking about the efforts from the Department of History, Urban Studies. I did a little bit of research and learned about the 1967 Legacy Program. I mean, and just congratulations to everyone who is taking seriously the idea of a racial reckoning and actually launching programs and initiatives to fulfill the promise, the unfulfilled promises of the previous kind of reckonings. So really great to be here and to offer this lecture. I also want to especially thank Elisa Jones, Dr. Jones, for the invitation. And she has a very unique ability of knowing when to follow up and when not to follow up around, email exchanges and nevertheless getting getting me going. I always appreciate prompt reminders, especially because I have a 2-month-old who you might hear at some point during the lecture. So just anyway, a big thank you to Elisa Jones for just, kind of respectfully reaching out and pushing this thing along. To our colleagues in the Department of History and the Center for Sustainable Development, many thanks for co-sponsoring the event. And to all of you who have taken time out of your busy days, and from what I understand, a very warm and beautiful day in Charleston to be here over Zoom. I greatly appreciate it. So what I want to do today, something of a plan, is to say a little bit about me and how I came to develop an interest in municipal finance and bond markets and indebtedness more generally. Since some of you have read the book, I won't dive and spend too much time recapping chapter by chapter what the book does, but nevertheless, just in case folks haven't had a chance to read the book, I'll pull out some rich vignettes and kind of punctuate some of the arguments and interpretive claims that the book offers. I want to end, and this will be a little bit of a risk because I'm no historian of Charleston or South Carolina, but I do want to try to extend the insights of the book to your local context. Obviously the book says a great deal about San Francisco. I think the insights extend far beyond the city by the bay, however, and I want to try to think a little bit and out loud with you, and hopefully that tees up some questions for the Q&A, which we can discuss further. And then we'll turn to the Q&A, which I hope to have plenty of time for. So if that plan is fine with you all, I'll just get started and share my screen. Just give me 1 second here. Let's see. Okay. You guys see my screen? Okay. All right, great. The title of the talk, The Bonds of Racial Inequality in Post-War America. I'll play on the title of the book, but I really want to kind of think a bit about the bonds, the kind of social ties that are distended and disrupted through debt finance, and also bonds as financial instruments that are issued every day in this country, and which are crucial to infrastructural and social services in the United States. And I'll focus in on post-war World II America, though happy to think about the long 20th century and what comes before, so to speak, and how debt finance plays out also here in the 21st century as well. My work focuses on the 20th century and lies at the intersection of urban history, African-American studies, and the history of capitalism. I'm interested in the financial processes and entanglements that underwrite racial inequality in America and the implications of those entanglements for democracy, public space, and increasingly social movements. This allows me to interrogate the powerful mechanisms of what I describe by way of the late Black political philosopher Charles Mills, the powerful mechanisms of illicit white racial advantage. How, that is, white Americans secured precious resources and life chances, not through individual merit, but due to the work whiteness performed throughout the 20th century. It also allows me to explore the range of tactics and strategies employed by African Americans who challenge the divestment and neglect of their communities. Let's see if I can go to the next slide. Okay. So excuse me, actually, let's do it like this. We'll have it be fancy. Okay. Okay, at first, well, let me take a step back. The bond market stuff, municipal bond finance stuff came much later, but I first began to develop an interest and really notice the problem of inequality as a child growing up in New York City. This was the kind of post-David Dinkins, Giuliani era, and had seen many neighbors plucked from communities and incarcerated and sent to facilities like Rikers Island and elsewhere. And really just getting a feel for the problem of inequality by way of neighborhood conversations and also the transportation routes I took day in and day out. So as I traveled by subway from my working class neighborhood in Queens, New York, to attend a posh, virtually all white private school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, I came to notice the qualitative and quantitative differences between familial wealth and disposable income. I noticed the recreational consequences of investment in certain parts of the city, but not others. My childhood was framed by the inequalities of wealth and space and the determined efforts of my parents to navigate the paradoxes of urban life. In the 1990s, I came to tangibly encounter inequality through brick and mortar and to understand its implications through the public discourse that would filter into private conversations about power, privilege, and justice with my family. That's a kind of background story of how one comes to study inequality, is those crucial conversations very early on. But as a scholar, as a historian of racial inequality in the 20th century, I see myself in conversation with scholars across a wide range of disciplines who have tried to account for the persistence of racial inequality. How do we explain the persistence despite, or perhaps because of, extraordinary changes in the political economic structure of American cities and suburbs? There are three leading interpretations that tend to focus on three discrete realms, that is, interpretations which focus in on work, housing, and penal control. And, for the non-historians, forgive me, I just want to kind of basically set up the historiography, the dominant interpretations, to kind of offer my flowers to those folks, but also kind of set the stage for why I focus on bond finance matters. What's distinct about focusing in on indebtedness in terms of the reproduction of racial inequality. So 3 interpretations. The first is the story of industrial decline. The disappearance of industrial work contributed to the production of, quote, inner city ghetto life, in the words of sociologist William Julius Wilson. This, combined with assaults on labor unions and declining unionization rates, greatly reduced the number of adult Black men in the formal labor force. Less work meant lower wages, and more precarious employment meant families without employer-based insurance that could be devastated by the hazards of daily life. So a story of industrial decline that focuses in on the Rust Belt, and also a story of industrial revitalization, for instance, through the attraction of manufacturers in parts of the American South. So if that's the kind of industrial decline story, there's also a story of retrenchment. And here is a document I pulled from the George Moscone archives, who was the mayor of San Francisco for a very short period of time, was assassinated not too long after taking office, which decries, it's a letter to Moscone decrying massive cuts to the prisoner medical program, and thinking about the devastation of such cuts, budget cuts, and programmatic cuts in the context of inflation and rising unemployment in 1976. But there's a story, really, in other words, of inequality made through retrenchment. And others whose stories turn on the changing conditions of work have pushed back on the declension narrative that is deindustrialization. So as deindustrialization ravaged the Rust Belt and exacerbated racial inequality, we can see Black women gaining a foothold, for instance, in state and state-related industries. Increased public spending during the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the creation of public sector jobs became, as the late Michael B. Cass noted, a sort of hidden labor market policy for Black women. Yet the expansion of the public sector was tentative at best. Between 1980 and 1990, the federal contribution to city budgets fell from 18 to 6.4%. So if public sector employment kept some Black families afloat, municipal retrenchment and privatization reversed many of these gains. So this is a story focusing in on the changing conditions of work, really the kind of short-lived, maybe not so short-lived, but the promise of affirmative action programs to expand a robust public sector for Black folks in particular in the post-civil rights era, but then thinking about inequalities that are deepened through retrenchment, deepened through privatization, deepened through budget cuts, which we've seen certainly accelerate in the 21st century. So the second story of racial inequality tends to focus in on housing. And some of you have probably seen these maps before, the famous Homeowners Loan Corporation residential security maps here for the city of San Francisco. And so others have attended to the persistence of racial inequality by way of focusing in on US housing policy. And by now, the story of New Deal housing policy is well known, certainly is familiar. And the so-called redlining maps have become a frequent reference point in discussions of the racial wealth gap. Having been structurally advantaged through public-private partnerships, white men and women formed paramilitary homeowner associations committed to white racial homogeneity to defend the privileging of themselves, really, as they moved to the suburbs and left inner cities. But there, the story focuses in on mortgage finance. It treats the mortgage instrument as a way to kind of tell a history of racial inequality through US housing policy. A similar related story as it pertains to housing is thinking about the afterlives of New Deal housing policies. So even after Congress ended redlining practices in 1965, the US housing market was marked by what Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor calls predatory inclusion, or how the inclusion of poor and working class African Americans as homeowners continued, quote, older predatory practices. Indeed, the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis and the erosion of Black wealth can be traced back to mid-20th century racist profiteering in the real estate industry, federal redlining policies, and their afterlives. So those are kind of two housing stories, one focusing in on the New Deal era and others that focus in on the post-New Deal era, the fall of the New Deal. And then lastly, there's the story of incarceration, penal control, right? And here, historians, geographers, and sociologists have traced the ways in which crime control techniques dispersed throughout urban social programs disrupted the lives of millions of American families. The extraction of Black men and women, which I mentioned at the beginning, depresses family earnings. And upon their release, folks scarred by felony convictions face housing insecurities, skeptical employers, and a liminal citizenship that constrains their voting rights and access to public benefits. And this deepens inequality. And so folks have focused in not just on the prison or the jail as a site of containment, but monitoring systems and other modes or expressions of the prison industrial complex, which tend to deepen racial inequality. So let's kind of tie these interpretations together. These are the leading interpretations which foreground the role of the government and federal policy in particular as the central actors and mechanisms in the making of racial inequality, again, despite massive political economic shifts and despite even the gains of the formal civil rights movement, whether you think about Brown v. Board or the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, inequality still nevertheless persists through, in some cases, changes in work, and some for others, housing policies, and for still others through incarceration. And so one of the upshots of these interpretations is not only a powerful critique of liberalism and the belief that individual behaviors are the basis for inequality, but also the assertion that redress lies at the foot of the federal government, which obviously gets us in the direction of reparations, which we could talk about much later. So I agree with most of these interpretations, but to my mind, racial inequality is expressed through more than wages, home ownership rates, and draconian limits on personal freedom. Racial inequality is also expressed and experienced through unequal investment in city streets. Some residents come to taste it because of neglected water aqueducts and pipes. It is confirmed by unequal access to the public itself. And when access is granted, reinforced by underfunded public schools, parks, and the basic infrastructure on which all American cities rely. And all of this is tied up with the ability to float a bond and coupled with interest rates and other borrowing terms and conditions. And for this reason, it is essential to turn to the private bond market and to see it as a powerful but understudied generator of inequality and disproportionate life chances. So what is the municipal bond market? What are municipal bonds? Bear with me, y'all. Don't tune out yet. Don't tune out. The bond market, at least as I approach it, is a politically constructed network that links state and local government borrowers, financiers, investors, and sellers of financial information, among others. In and through that market, borrowers issue bonds. Municipal bonds are basically loans used by government issuers or those with tax-exempt borrowing powers to distribute the huge cost of capital improvement projects over an extended period of time. The municipal bond market then is a central means by which cities, suburbs, and the like pay for everything from public housing projects, sewage systems, and public transportation improvements, among other large-scale infrastructure projects. And that spins out to create still other opportunities for manufacturers, for instance. We can think about the companies who supply the iron piping that's going to be essential to waste management or sewage treatment. So if we think about the bond market and what it generates, it's not just profits and buying and selling between issuers and financial institutions, but it begets and creates, enables even still other opportunities for those who aren't directly involved in the immediate transaction, but which nevertheless have to supply the critical infrastructure to realize the whole point of a bond sale. So here, just as an example to think about change over time, is a display advertisement from the New York Times from Salomon Brothers. And you could just read the first line: during the past 11 months of 1970, Salomon Brothers managed or co-managed $1.7 billion worth of general obligation and revenue issues. And we can talk about the difference between general obligation bonds, which are usually backed by property taxes, and revenue issues, which have some earmarked source to pay back its holders. For instance, toll facilities, or perhaps even tuition or room and board, I should say, for revenue bonds issued by, say, the College of Charleston. So we can think about that Salomon Brothers on its own managing or co-managing $1.7 billion worth of those debt instruments in 1970. And that's just one firm, or at least the syndicates with which it was partnered. But today's bond market is robust. Quote, an average of nearly $435 billion in new municipal securities were issued each year in the last decade, noted a recent regulatory report. So a massive market. And that massive market often has been described as a sleepy industry. It's rather boring and certainly not as full. The perception is not nearly as full of examples of, stock traders and stock prices. The bond market as a sleepy industry, but a massive one, a robust one. But to my mind, more than dollars and cents are at stake. At the center of the decision to borrow is an ethical and political choice, deciding who and what is worthy of debt with profound material consequences. And because there is a general unfamiliarity with the subject, we have missed asking why it is that American cities are dependent on financiers, rating agencies, and the private market in the first place. Why must they turn to the market to fulfill their most fundamental responsibilities, the provision of infrastructure and social services to their citizens? My book, The Bonds of Inequality, Debt in the Making of the American City, takes up these questions. The Bonds of Inequality is about the politics of municipal finance, but I think it's much more. It resituates the history of urban development and racial inequality after World War II and the financing networks that made the construction of urban infrastructure possible. The story picks up during a fleeting moment of low interest rates just after the war. It ends in the 1980s, a period when high interest rates punished cities already reeling from rounds of retrenchment. Rather than treat federal policy as the benchmarks and narrative anchors of post-war urban history, which is typical in the genre, I suggest that shifting interest rates gave this period unique historical shape. The convergence between investors in search of tax shelters from high federal marginal tax rates and the promise of low borrowing costs for cities power the reconfiguration of the built environment. Although centered in San Francisco, by bringing to life the individuals, institutions, and milieu through which borrowed funds were generated, my book provides a unique view of the post-war city, one in which the critical dynamics that drove its creation extend beyond the boundaries of San Francisco and local politics to the banks, credit raters, and the national municipal bond market. Whereas most histories of urban inequality have tended to focus on real estate agents, mortgage bankers, homeowner associations, and labor unions. In this account, my account, bondholders, financiers, and sellers of financial information, as well as municipal technocrats, are the key actors. Beyond the difference in actors, the other key distinction is that unlike stories that have privileged local heroes and villains, this story follows the life, if you will, of a municipal bond that is handled by a set of local and national actors that function within and independent of local idiosyncrasy. So really trying to think about seeing debt as a way to break out of the familiar case studies, which are the dominant mode of storytelling in urban history. Obviously, there are different ways of breaking out of the municipal boundaries. One can follow the flow of ideas, as the great work of Christopher Clement has done around urban renewal, the kind of transatlantic exchange of ideas. And for my mind, what I'm trying to do is think about the life of a municipal bond from its conception, as approved by voters, as underwritten by financial institutions who may be in the city or may be elsewhere, and finally in the investment portfolios of corporations incorporated elsewhere, as a way to kind of think about the national implications of a local story, to think about the ways in which credit is transformed in place-based ways, even as it is generating tax-exempt interest income for holders who have perhaps never set foot in the issuing community itself. To tell the story, the book draws on a range of little used or newly discovered sources, from the Daily Bond Buyer to the personal papers of Alan K. Brown, once described as Mr. Municipal Bond. And for folks who have read the book, he is the key actor, a gentleman who felt like he never got his just due at Bank of America and was a copious note taker, wrote thick memos to try to appeal for more personnel, try to appeal for more office space, and to try to insist that what municipal bond financiers were doing was crucial to the payment of, for instance, dividends to stockholders. Crucial, in other words, to the overall development and growth of Bank of America. And his kind of copiousness, frustrations even, was what I encountered in the archive after he had deposited his personal papers at UC Berkeley. So without him, the book basically doesn't get written. For that, I'm very grateful to Mr. Alan K. Brown. The book also pulls from state archives, engaging the critiques of elected officials. It reads the documents of credit rating analysts, not as transparent reflections of the economy, but as a window onto the ideas and habits even of those who upgraded and downgraded the bonds of cities. And it places the Black press, the African-American press in the Bay Area, in conversation with other journalistic critiques of the bonding process. In so doing, I uncover the ways in which African-Americans engage matters of municipal finance, which I referred to in the book as Black bond politics. And that's something we can take up in the Q&A, the kind of financial inquest, the kind of willingness of Black journalists from the Chicago Defender or the Amsterdam News to actually probe how it is that pension funds, for instance, are underwriting the bonds issued by segregated Southern municipalities after Brown v. Board, and following the money and wondering why it is that their funds are being used in such a way, and actually trying to develop social movement tactics and strategies to try to turn off the golden faucet, if you will, that kept segregation, that made segregated public schools possible, again, despite the ruling from the highest court in the land. The book makes two arguments, a number of claims throughout, but to my mind, two major arguments. The first relates to the structural dependence of local governments on the bond market and the origins of that dependence. Again, the first question I had opened up with is why it is that cities are dependent on the municipal bond market anyway. And especially when it doesn't have to be that way. There are other ways of generating funds, which we see certainly in parts of Western Europe during the early 70s. Federal revenue sharing and other ways of generating funds. But the book tries to offer an interpretation of how structural dependence came to be, or at least how it was rekindled. New Deal banking reforms, commonly lauded for their accomplishments, are equally notable for what they did not do. To take one example, the famed Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which separated investment from commercial banking, did not sever the role of commercial and investment banks as lender to the American state. This allowed for the continued distribution of financial power among the private sector. The impact was that public infrastructure and social services would continue to be financed along a public-private axis. This coupled waste management systems and school construction, for instance, to the lending criteria of an unelected fraternity of financiers, bond attorneys, and rating analysts. It has been said that debt is a means of governance, and if so, New Deal banking reforms were the legislative trigger. The second argument is that racial inequities in San Francisco were critically tied to these financial entanglements. The racial politics of the mid-century bond market, which privileged infrastructure for white people, even as it was paid for by all citizens, were shaped by local development policies. So it's that last point that I want to turn to pull out a few examples that speak to this latter argument. And my hope is to highlight the impacts of municipal debt and seemingly abstract financial processes and the ways those have a great impact on the lives of city residents. In so doing, I illustrate that city residents aren't undifferentiated subjects. The racial hierarchy in which they were slotted became an essential mediating factor in distributing the burdens and promise even of municipal debt. So I kind of begin the story trying to think about post-World War II developmental pressures. And to my mind, their infrastructural pressures were crucial. So let's begin kind of there, the extraordinary pressures facing post-war San Francisco. The built environment was greatly taxed during World War II, and remaking it was the first imperative. You can think of the parks that were appropriated for wartime purposes, or the weight of heavy war machinery being used for war production, deteriorating streets that had not been upgraded for some 20 years, built during the early 20th century in the context of progressive reform, and that went without improvements during the 1930s in the context of the Great Depression. So think about streets and sewage systems and water treatment facilities built during the early 20th century, greatly taxed, not just by war machinery, but also the second point, which is the mass migration to the city of San Francisco. So according to one of the city's largest landlords, war production also caused a, quote, mass immigration, which is without duplicate since the days of gold, of course, referring to the gold rush. Between 1940 and 1950, San Francisco's population rose from close to 635,000 people to more than 775,000. Perhaps most astonishingly, the city's Black population jumped from 4,800 to more than 43,000 in those same years. So we're thinking about basically the infrastructural consequences of the second Great Migration, or if in the case of San Francisco, its first Great Migration. Additionally, there were distributionary struggles. How to meet the infrastructural demands of longtime residents and newcomers. How to accommodate the calls for new housing in place of slums, new parks in lieu of makeshift playgrounds underneath highways, new public schools to replace what were described as cracker box-like structures. Municipal technocrats in charge of the purse, the accountants, the comptrollers, and so forth, had to deliver and manage these fiscal demands to set the city on the path towards economic growth while also maintaining political stability. And the last pressure is one of land. How would they do all of this in a city that was described as land hungry? At less than 50 square miles, San Francisco had considerably less land available than there was in, say, Los Angeles, just continually expanding, Chicago or Detroit. Indeed, quote, there was little vacant land upon which new structures could be placed, noted a group of city planners. So in the spring of 1946, some of the top rated cities could turn to the municipal bond market and borrow huge chunks, huge amounts at less than 1%. So we're thinking about the historic borrowing opportunity to respond to some of those pressures. This historically low cost to borrow could prove the antidote to the overlapping demographic, infrastructural, and fiscal pressures. Because land was fixed, the immediate question before San Francisco's technocrats became which kinds of projects, which neighborhoods, and which communities would be rendered worthy of debt. And that goes back to the ethical dimensions of debt that I highlighted at the beginning. But the question of worthiness was layered. At once a consideration of different interest groups in the city, a matter of governance, and an issue of economic growth. Put simply, the approach to infrastructural investment became a reflection of political, economic, social, and ethical considerations. Economic growth, which as we've seen and heard before, heard discussed as a pursuit, right? Idealized pursuit. But economic growth was not an objective, deracialized pursuit. It rested on the ground of whiteness. In San Francisco, this meant adapting and fashioning the built environment to meet the demands of the white middle class. Embedded in countless city planning documents, which you see here, just briefly, is a report from the Department of City Planning, a fairly common report, but basically just touting the merits of staying in the city, of repurposing land near the bay, to kind of provide broad lawns, trees, flowers, tennis courts, and so forth, as an attempt to keep white professionals from leaving the city, more or less to resist the pull of suburbanization, drawn instead to the proximity of work downtown, gorgeous views of the San Francisco Bay, and improvements to the consumer playground. And foundational to this hope was an ideological belief that privilege the white male subject as the basis for economic growth. Convince them to stay as residents, workers, and consumers, and you might avoid the horrors of urban decline, which is on the minds of all city officials as they're thinking about the kind of federal subsidies that are pulling white suburbanites and increasingly manufacturers out to the suburbs and trying to stave off urban decline. So we kind of think about the politics of consumption. Historians have, of course, done a great job doing this, whether it be Liz Cohen or Allison Eisenberg, Meg Jacobs, and so forth. They've highlighted as well its importance in shaping post-war racial, class, and gender identity. But they have largely missed the infrastructural basis of the consumer's republic, to borrow a familiar title. We might take the example of parking as indicative of the broader and costly effort to accommodate white consumers, tourists, and professionals, as part and parcel of the broader infrastructural investment in middle-class whiteness. In November 1955, San Franciscans had rejected an $11 million bond measure for off-street parking. The San Francisco Parking Authority soon emerged as a vehicle to circumvent the wishes of voters. In the spring of 1958, that authority borrowed $4.5 million from two investment banks, using a portion of the funds to construct a massive car garage beneath Civic Center Plaza. The borrowing arrangement allowed shoppers to find parking before strolling the aisles of Saks Fifth Avenue, but it did much more. The authority had to generate $325,000 annually to pay parking garage bondholders. If revenues fell short, however, the city and its taxpayers were responsible for covering any remaining deficits for a period of time. The debt arrangement conscripted all San Franciscans into a project they had never voted on. The city's Black and brown residents became liable for an arrangement designed especially for white middle-class shoppers. So the example of parking also is interesting to my mind because it's the kind of pre-neoliberal, pre-privatization story, to see the ways in which parking from the very beginning, when financed through debt instruments, is absolutely about revenue generation, absolutely about trying to make sure that bondholders are made whole. And that's a pre-neoliberal story that happens before privatization, which begs the question, why do we need such meta-narratives to begin with? Why not focus in on the relations of indebtedness to really think about what changes over time between the New Deal and its supposed collapse in the 1980s. Even once stigmatized neighborhoods could be incorporated into a model of economic growth predicated on white middle-class consumption. San Francisco's Chinatown, for instance, became an asset to the city, in part because it afforded white San Franciscans, suburbanites, and tourists a novel chance to consume. this converged with the efforts of longtime Chinatown residents to preserve this cultural enclave. And so the example there is, you can kind of look at, again, those city planning documents in the late 30s and throughout the 40s that sees Chinatown and the Western Addition Fillmore neighborhood, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, as problems for the city. As you know, anybody familiar with urban history and those documents, the language of blight, dilapidation being used to basically justify and advance the project of wholesale clearance. But Chinatown, described in that way, nevertheless maintains this kind of territorial integrity. And the question becomes, why subject the Western Addition Fillmore neighborhood to wholesale clearance, but also maintain Chinatown? And so that was a big question that I had to try to think about, especially given that San Francisco is not a black-white binary story at all. And so to my mind, it's about seeing Chinatown becomes a really important example for thinking about this broader argument around the infrastructural investment in whiteness to maintain what is a problem and to in fact turn the problem into an asset in order to again try to keep white suburbanites attracted to the city and keep folks from leaving the city, and also to attract tourists. So we're thinking about the rise of tourism as crucial to economic growth as well. So just briefly for folks who have never been on this fancy looking spaceship-like mode of transportation, this is BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, which is a 3-county-wide transportation system that was really kind of in the making for a very long time. The efforts pick up in the 1950s. Major massive bond issue passed in 1962. Takes a great deal of time for the project to get off the ground and below ground, so to speak. So here's a photo of that system once it's up and running as part of the official statement to bondholders. So again, what we're thinking about is these transportation systems projects is not just about passengers, design, but also the appeals to bondholders who are going to keep the district, which manages its finances, which manages the system, keep them accountable to figure out, well, how actually our revenue is going to be generated? Is it time for a fare increase? What about those strikes? Right? How might that disrupt productivity? So we're thinking about a different kind of element that oftentimes is kind of hidden from view, but which nevertheless shape local dynamics in really important ways. But I show this example to kind of really underscore the point of working class whiteness and the infrastructural investment in working class whiteness. Indeed, San Francisco's infrastructural investment in whiteness rested on what I described somewhat just cumbersomely as the intra-racial cross-class compact, okay? It's not the greatest way of describing it, but more or less, whereby white workers erected the urban amenities white middle-class residents and visitors enjoyed and depended on, right? So we're thinking about this cross-class compact among upper-class white Americans, middle-class white Americans, and working-class white Americans. By 1948, state and local government capital outlays reached $3.7 billion, which paid for everything from highways to streets, schools to hospitals, sewage treatment to water systems, electric utilities to transportation, parks to urban renewal. These capital outlays not only remade the built environment, it also afforded segregated wages to white workers. In San Francisco during the 1950s and early 1960s, skilled construction jobs were for white men, and the city's building trade unions worked to keep it that way. Some Black craftsmen found work through cement masons Local 580 and laborers Local 261, but many more were slotted into other jobs or went without employment altogether. The International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union rarely confronted the Building Trades Council to desegregate craft unions, and the city rarely interfered. So there's the point. There is the kind of segregated, a portion of the segregated pie for white workers who are part of these segregated unions, who build the infrastructure. Again, that is essential for the forms of consumption by white middle-class Americans. And then there's this upper class dimension, which I think is really kind of one of the more important interventions in the book, We can think about the recent discussion, very important recent discussion around wealth, right, as distinct from income. But the historian Sven Beckert has appropriately acknowledged or noted that post the Gilded Age, post the kind of progressive era, wealth as a kind of salient topic, as a contested issue, starts to fade from public discourse, fade from public discourse. I mean, the recent conversations around the racial wealth gap is an important corrective. But one of the things I tried to do in the book is to show the ways in which capital flowed upward before white folks parked their cars in downtown garages, parking garages, or attended the new San Francisco Giants baseball stadium, also debt financed, or before they arrived downtown via the rapid transit system. Indeed, before white workers even began constructing these projects, institutional and wealthy individual investors collected tax-exempt interest income on the bonds they held. Although it is difficult to determine the identities of individual bondholders, shielded as they were by fiduciaries, they were almost certainly white. And this was at once an artifact and continuing means of the racial wealth gap. So this kind of is, Zeb had mentioned at the beginning, my other work on histories of racial capitalism, I'm interested in the striking reproductions of racial capitalism despite, or perhaps because of major transformations, whether it be emancipation and the general strike of Black folks, or the fall of Jim Crow, but nevertheless striking reproductions of racial capitalism. And so slavery, dispossession, racial discrimination, and exclusion were foundational to white wealth. The bonding process became still another means of wealth creation for white people across class lines, which I could say more about if folks are interested in. So now, the infrastructural investment in whiteness was often predicated on the dispossession and displacement of San Francisco's Black and brown residents. The urban renewal project of the Western Addition Fillmore neighborhood is particularly illustrative. And briefly, this is a photo of some guys getting down at Bop City. We're thinking about kind of different changes in jazz at the time in San Francisco as a mecca. As a budding mecca, if you will, for the kind of commercial artistic expressions among Black folks. So if the 1941 edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book is any indication, San Francisco had few hotels and restaurants, few barbershops and service stations afforded Black travelers. But not long after their arrival and settlement, Black folks went to work, building a vibrant, albeit segregated commercial landscape. There was the New Orleans Swing Club and Elsie's Breakfast Nook. In 1942, Wesley Johnson Sr. purchased the building and converted the first floor to house the Texas Playhouse and the second floor for the Hotel Texas. Black San Franciscans in their finest garb might hope to catch Count Basie, Billie Holiday, and Sarah Vaughan at the Bop City Celebrity Night. Willie Brown, later the city's first African-American mayor, arrived to the city in 1951. He and other Black San Franciscans would, quote, get dressed to kill. They sported, quote, Stacey Adams shoes with the white strings showing they had been cleaned up with Clorox. So we can think about this landscape of folks getting dressed, getting fly, and trying to make this neighborhood, this new city, their own. In some, the Fillmore was the cultural hub for San Francisco's Black population, journalist Wade Woods recalled, and it was financially thriving. Yet the pressures on post-war San Francisco, those pressures I mentioned at the beginning, overpowered Black entrepreneurial ambitions, smothered a cultural renaissance, ruptured newly formed social ties. Just as Black folks were making the Fillmore into their own image, the city's planners, supervisors, and other interested parties marked the neighborhood for wholesale clearance. The story of urban renewal is familiar, and the example of Negro removal during the 1950s, as James Baldwin described it in 1963, has been folded into a much longer national story of the seemingly timeless mechanism of Black expendability. What is less known is how urban renewal was financed and how Negro removal was intimately tied to the entanglements, dependencies in terms of municipal debt. So here is briefly when I started graduate school, I didn't have glasses. I didn't need them. But by the time I finished, as anybody who's gone through the PhD process, their eyes got worse. My eyes got really bad. And it was made worse in part by looking at documents like this, which is a typical notice of sale for a set of debt securities issued by the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. So this is, if I had the photo of the book itself, drawn from a massive volume, probably about 1,100 pages, size 6 font. And this is kind of one of the sources that I use to try to think about both the debts issued by the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, the terms of those debt arrangements, and to later figure out who actually underwrote and purchased those debt securities. So in late September 1958, and so I'll just pull out the material so you don't have to squint and ruin your eyes. So in late September 1958, Joseph Alioto, chairman of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, advertised the sale of $11 million in short-term notes to finance urban renewal in the Western Addition Fillmore neighborhood. The notice of sale detailed that the debt was a special obligation of the agency, but was also, quote, secured by a requisition agreement between the agency and the federal government. The legal opinions of bond attorneys Orwick, Dahlquist, Harrington, and Sutcliffe were furnished to underscore the validity of the notes. In basic terms, the redevelopment agency used this contract with the federal government as security to borrow through the private bond market, ideally at more favorable interest rates. As the principal player in buying, holding, and selling California municipal debt, Bank of America purchased the notes in October 1958. In so doing, they had their cake and they ate it too. Its bankers profited from infrastructure for white suburbanites and the attempt to remake San Francisco into a hospitable place for white consumers. And they more or less profited from the displacement of longtime residents and the emplacement of the infrastructure critical for a new set of people who were idealized subjects, idealized residents, idealized consumers. The infrastructural investment in whiteness allowed for profits through displacement and emplacement, profits through destruction of slums and the infrastructure laid in its wake. Equipped with the borrowed funds, the redevelopment agency executed eminent domain, facilitated Negro removal, acquired and cleared land. Its city planners helped make white middle class and upper class space by selling land to developers of high-rise luxury apartments. The agency then used the proceeds of land sales to pay off federal loans. And if there were delays in site clearance and reselling that land, they also collected rental revenue from Black tenants. So we can begin with a source like this to think about the kind of processes set in motion through the very basic and banal quotidian issuance of a debt obligation, to think about questions of real estate, land, rental revenue, housing struggles, and the like. The multiple and overlapping debt entanglements between the federal government and the redevelopment agency, between the agency and Bank of America, between the city and its bondholders constituted a powerful and unexplored vector in shaping local development policies. Because land was fixed, reclaiming and selling previously inhabited land to developers of high-rise commercial office buildings and luxury apartments became a cornerstone of land use policy. Privileging this form of land use might allow the redevelopment agency to repay its debts. A successful development might generate enough revenues for the city at large, guaranteeing timely interest and principal payments to other bondholders. It might also obviate higher property taxes, helping to maintain political stability for whoever was in charge. In short, post-war cities need revenue, and in San Francisco, this city bet on whiteness. The pressures to ensure that new housing, commercial development, and amenities would generate enough funds to pay off creditors led to the preferencing of those tenants and workers deemed low risk, a racialized assessment that equated to white professionals. We often think about dispossession in terms of property as the dissolution of the ownership rights to land and income generating assets. But the story of urban renewal in the Western Addition speaks to another aspect of dispossession. Black folks were displaced and deprived not just of housing and business establishments, but also of the ability to call this city, San Francisco, their home. Even those who remained would come to reside in the city whose structural foundation depended on whiteness. And so a city that wasn't built for them could never be theirs. But that doesn't mean they didn't try. The infrastructural investment in whiteness and dispossession through debt set the stage for the revolts of the 1960s. Time prevents me from expounding on the revolts of Black folks, the residents of Chinatown, and of white workers and middle-class white women against the post-war debt arrangement. In chapter 6 of my book, Revolt, I discuss Black bond politics, legal injunctions, and extraordinary critiques of the city's disproportionate spending policies. But the point I want to land on is twofold. First and foremost, these were revolts against the post-war debt arrangement that focused on local bond measures and were occasionally successful. And yet they failed to ascend to the level of critique that might expose the structural relationship between borrowers and lenders, a critical foundation of racial inequality. In other words, focusing primarily on the bond referenda without asking, again, the question I began with of why dependence at all on the private bond market. Second, the structural dependence of local governments on the private bond market, a dependence rekindled through New Deal reform, actually allowed bankers to fold these revolts into their broader calculations about investing in cities. This meant critical acts of resistance, for instance, the civil rights movement and urban rebellions of the 1960s became the basis for credit rating downgrades and extractive interest rate penalties that entrench racial inequality, presage future fiscal distress, and further harm those savvy enough to be critical of municipal debt in the first place. As I say in the book, the revolt that mattered most was the revolt that occurred in the minds of creditors. So let me kind of do something I mentioned before that I want to kind of bring it to the local context, to the folks out in Charleston and South Carolina more generally, and kind of basically extend the insight or attempt to extend the insights of what I do in the book and what I've tried to offer here in the talk today to the local context. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will, I'll just kind of conclude in that way, and then we can open it up to Q&A, which I think we should have plenty of time for. Okay, so I want to focus kind of really on offer two provocations and research questions that come into view when we focus on municipal debt. And there are two issues I want to highlight. The first relates to climate change and ecological destruction, which I think is appropriate given the co-sponsors of this event. So in November 1989, the bond buyer reported on the expected financial fallout of Hurricane Hugo. Officials in South Carolina estimated the cost of damages would top $4 billion. Some hoped optimistically that the Federal Emergency Management Agency would cover a share of the damages. Still, those in Charleston expected they might have to issue short-term debt, quote, to manage storm expenditures, and will probably have to raise taxes as well, according to one observer. In other words, they might have to borrow to pay for property damage and debris removal. So to my mind, just with that quick example of the fallout of Hugo, the tax politics of ecological destruction is clearly tied up with the politics of municipal debt. And as such, we hear the voices of people like George Lung, an associate manager at Moody's Investor Services, analyzing the future of the city and state. And it's worth thinking about what he has to say about how Charleston and the state of South Carolina moves forward. We hear him reflecting on how missed revenue targets and diminished tax collections might shape future bond ratings. Reflecting as well on how the hurricane might open up new avenues for development that, quote, is bound to have a stimulative effect as workers flood into the state and houses are restored. So when we think about the basic sort of transformations, demographic migrations, the wake of a hurricane, there are also a set of observers, again, who we rarely hear from or think of, who have thoughts about both the consequences, the fiscal costs, but also the opportunities. And to get a sense of what happens when state officials or city officials from Charleston travel to New York, for instance, to meet with those credit rating analysts. What is said? What is offered? What is promised? What is the path of development offered? How does that path change over time? What have been the municipal fiscal costs of man-made environmental disasters and ecological destruction is the general question. How have those costs been apportioned? Who, in other words, has had to fit the bill? And to whom were interest rate penalties and premiums paid? Which institutions, which individual investors? What course of development has the state pursued since Hurricane Hugo? And how does this relate to what has been described by Andrew Carl as a rather tragic story of dispossession in the Daufuskie Islands? We're thinking about increased tax assessments and tax bills and how that relates to debt service payments. And are there alternative ways of financing, perhaps described as grassroots financing, alternatives to reliance on the municipal bond market? And I'm sure that may be of interest to folks affiliated with the Sustainability Center to think about how you actually how to finance sustainable development and protective infrastructure without also reifying and deepening the inequities built into, arguably hardwired into, the municipal bond market. And the second issue is really a quick one. Returning again to the bond buyer, we see instances. Actually, I was really struck by this yesterday. I don't know why I was surprised, but it was good to see, given that this talk was today. But we see instances of the College of Charleston actually issuing revenue bonds in support of its academic and administrative facilities. So in June 2007, the college issued a $40.48 million bond issue that was sold to UBS Securities at a true interest cost of 4.74%. We see instances of the state of South Carolina issuing a package of bonds for various purposes, including for the College of Charleston. So how do these bond issues fit within the College of Charleston's capital expansion program? Right? I mean, is this a story that's recently been told by the scholar Devarian Baldwin about universities, where that basically universities set the floor for local housing costs, labor costs, or not just purveyors of education, but also control property, manage labor relations, and so forth. But how does all of that relate to municipal finance, the bond market, and how does the College of Charleston relate or position itself as you know, the famed and historic municipal college? How does it navigate and maneuver within the bond market? And I guess the other question, which is perhaps on city college administrators' minds, especially in the wake of COVID, is what is the relationship between debt finance and higher education here in South Carolina? And what happens when revenue falls short? So if the College of Charleston issues a revenue bond and there's certain revenues that are on which they depend to make sure they can pay back bondholders, what happens when revenues fall short because of, say, a pandemic? And so this is all to say that what are the entanglements between the institutions that we are familiar with, that we navigate, and the wider financial networks and mechanisms, entanglements even, and what are the consequences for public space, for public education, for where we live, how we live, and life chances more generally. So that's coming from someone who doesn't know too much about the history of the city and the state, although I will say that that's where my dad's family is from, though we're 3 generations New Yorkers at this point. So at some point I got to go home. But with that, I'll end and just kind of open it up to Q&A. Really grateful for your time and attention, and looking forward to the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. That was phenomenal. And your little foray into Charleston and South Carolina bond markets there at the end opens up so many questions, I'm sure, for people. I just kind of want to start us off a little bit by, again, thanking you for your book, for your work, for coming and sharing this with us. Honestly, you know, your research sort of opened up a new window to me into systemic racism in urban settings in ways that I had not fully comprehended before, sort of outside of the traditional narratives, as you were saying, and opened up this window that was both good to know, but as we were, speaking just briefly before we started this session, that, these things aren't nefarious in the sense that they're hidden and illegal. These are perfectly legal means of inculcating disparities, right? Long-term disparities that maybe most of us were not fully aware of. One of the things that came out of some of the conversations we had in the reading groups, many things came up, but the built environment and the sort of ideas you just again referred to of the built environment and public access, deciding what gets public investment, where that public investment takes place, what are the public spaces that are being created. And what really struck me was thinking about how those decisions then have such repercussions as who gets to be in those spaces. You know, I spent many years, you know, I also lived in Chicago, and you sort of it becomes very clear who's being policed in and out of certain public areas, especially in downtown Chicago, and where all those public investments are happening, who gets to be in those spaces. And I just want to sort of tie that back to what you just pointed out about how this is not a problem just of the past, especially in places like Charleston, where we're looking at how to deal with increasing populations. Where do those highways go, and how does that affect flooding? What do we do about environmental concerns and sea level rise, and which neighborhoods are going to be invested in and which are not? I don't know if you would just share with us maybe a little more of what you saw in your research and sort of what your thinking is about what it means to have public space when this is the true context of who's making those decisions. Because the tie between local democracy, which sort of seemed so promising, and that by the time you get to the bond measures being voted on, like these conversations and decisions have already been made, right, in ways that disinvest certain populations.
Yeah, I think that's just a great movement between the historical stuff and the contemporary across cities in a comparative way. So thank you for the question. I mean, I guess the first thing I'll say is to focus in on municipal debt and the bond market, again, kind of it raises the question, what is the public, or rather questions the bifurcation between the public and the private. I mean, and this is not a novel move. I mean, folks who focus in on political economy, the ways in which the state shapes markets, have long kind of questioned and challenged the strict dichotomy between the so-called public and the private. So maybe one could even say that when I describe the bond market as a private market, maybe that's a misnomer. It's always a kind of public-private interface and interaction. And especially as you just kind of gestured towards, Elisa, that which is public, infrastructure, streets, and so forth, is absolutely tied up with the generation of private funds, private capital, and the decisions around what gets financed, how, and what terms, and so forth, is hardly democratic, and it's certainly not public. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to kind of say, not just try to historicize the making of structural dependence on the bond market, but to ask why it is that we barely know anything at all about that, which is so fundamental, right? And so to see the insulation and removal of bond finance from popular input, popular awareness, is itself a historic project. It picks up in the late 30s. It's kind of born out of a legitimate concern with the corruption of boss rule, right? And the ways in which late 19th centuries were run, and the ways in which there was a kind of pay for play that you know, technocrats and progressive reformers wanted to get out of the system of municipal governance. But that leads to more or less the total insulation of spending decisions, which projects are financed from popular input and awareness, and instead it becomes a technocratic realm decided on by appointees who have the kind of specialized knowledge, and the financiers and other key actors whose expertise is valued to shape spending decisions. And so that is a long way of saying that, you know, this is not only about what is the public when really there's private money there, but also how folks, who actually gets a chance to weigh in, and what are the consequences, as you mentioned, for public space. I mean, this is very interesting. Like, so Brown, who I mentioned, Alan Brown, who I mentioned at the beginning, is at once bond financier for Bank of America. He's also on the local bond screening committee. which screens issues well before they ever appear before the public. He's on the committee precisely because he's a market maker in the municipal bond market, and his expertise, access to capital, social ties to investors is seen as an asset for the city of San Francisco. But that kind of bond screening committee is a small selective one, and we have to ask, what are the ways in which the kind of views of development, the appropriate course of development as articulated by bankers like Brown, who then become appointed to local screening committees, how does that shape local spending priorities? Which projects get invested in and funded? And so Brown then is the way of kind of almost, again, obviating the question I get oftentimes, which is, well, is it the bond market, is it local government? I mean, what you see is he's the actual, the person who actually cuts across both realms to, again, kind of undermine the idea that they're actually discrete and distinct to begin with. So, anyway, I hope that answers your question. I mean, thinking about the public, which projects get funded, and what does it mean to fight? And this is a colleague, John Robinson at Princeton, who pointed this out in a response to a roundtable on my book. It's like, what does it mean to fight for the public, to push for remunicipalization and the fight against privatization when, from the beginning, at least from the early 20th century onwards, the so-called public was always financed through private resources? Is there another kind of public to which we can turn and kind of revitalize that doesn't reify or at least leave unaddressed the kind of private financial workings that were there from the beginning?
Thank you so much for that. I know, so if folks want to raise their hands to ask a question, that's great. If you would like to place your question in the chat, that's fine. I had a message from Dr. Covert letting us know that the chat had been inadvertently closed. I'm sorry about that. Dr. Covert, would you like to share the question that you were hoping to ask? If you raise your hand, I can unmute you to do so. Hi. And then I see we have Irina, Dr. Grigova also would like to ask a question after. Great, thank you.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for this really provocative study and talk, and thank you for taking the time to think about Charleston. And I especially appreciate that you brought up hurricane and disasters. One of the things that I came to your book with an interest in was actually earthquakes. And I was kind of surprised that you didn't go there, but I get why that would have opened up some messiness. But one of the questions I do have is that, when you talked about hurricanes and climate change here, one of the current things that we're debating in Charleston is a seawall, which has a lot of implications for finance, where we're getting money for that, but also, of course, who's being affected and how, which communities would be potential beneficiaries of a seawall, which ones would be harmed by that. And so, I guess my question is, one thing I was thinking about as I was reading your book and listening to your talk are the sort of potential ways to get around these types of financial problems on a smaller scale, like building a park or financing schools. But when you're thinking on like a macro level, like climate change, I'm having a harder time envisioning, like, how do you do that work? Like, how do you save the sea islands with grassroots work? And so I'm curious just to hear some more of your thoughts about that, actually, because I feel like that's something that I'm struggling to wrap my head around as I think about the various plans I see coming forth here. So thank you.
I mean, just really excellent. Really excellent. You and I are kind of on the same wavelength. So I like to think about this as the dilemmas of finance in the age of the Anthropocene. And so, you write a book. I had an argument that was really not so forthright. I mean, it's there through the engagement of people like Wright Patman and William Proxmire, which is essentially trying to remove at least the sale of information or the collection of information out of the hands of the private rating agencies, and to actually ask, why we need the private bond market entirely, and why we need the bond market, and whether it's possible to turn to, for instance, grants or low interest loans. I mean, rising interest rates are going to greatly disrupt that vision. So the argument, kind of subtle one, I don't know, people picked up on it, but is to think about federal financial power as an alternative to the structural dependence on the private bond market. So that was the kind of argument to kind of revisit the arguments of Patman, Proxmire, and others. And I thought a lot about this, especially during the early days of the pandemic with the municipal liquidity facility, thinking about the Federal Reserve as thinking about alternative ways of, again, supporting cities and local governments. And so yet it's not so much that I'm backtracking. It's just that we have to think about two issues. And the first is we don't have much time given rising sea levels and so forth. Finance still, nevertheless, it's for all its problems, is perhaps the quickest way to accelerate resources on a mass scale across many different constituencies. So to me, the dilemma is one of, do you turn to embrace the typical ways of generating funds to build, for instance, a seawall, and other critical infrastructure, protective infrastructure, even if it means deepening the inequities, even if it means deepening the structural dependence? Or are there other alternatives to raising the funds which are critical? And to be honest, over the last year or so, I'm not all that optimistic that even if we were to use federal financial power, given the kind of minoritarian rule in Congress, given the kind of composition of the courts, that such a reliance or turn to federal financial power would actually ever get off the ground, to say nothing of the kind of what's been described as the deference of localism in the ways in which federal funds find their ways into the pockets of a handful of folks, find their ways into certain communities and not others. So this is, to me, the dilemmas of finance that I've moved a little bit away from that earlier argument around grants, low interest loans, and to then think about the problem of time, which is not on our side, and to try to figure out how to mobilize resources on the most equitable of terms. I also recently read a piece in the Law and Political Economy blog. I encourage folks to read that. It's just amazing content around the idea of a just transition for finance itself. And trying to think about communities, for instance, in the East Bay, I live in the East Bay here in California, who are trying to think about raising funds outside of Wall Street and outside of the federal government as well, outside of even the kind of nonprofit complex, by way of, for instance, removing the retirement savings from financial markets and allowing people to leverage their own retirements to invest ostensibly, or rather at this point in time, in terms of purchasing land for farming, right, or for real estate to kind of decommodify housing. But whether or not a similar kind of grassroots financing works when we're talking about infrastructure and social services, that's a big question. And so I do think you have kind of three models. One, which is the usual way in which we do things through the bond market. The second is the kind of grant federal financial power, which has the kind of robust, machinery behind it. And the third, about which, again, for the reasons I talked about in terms of Congress and so on, and the Supreme Court, to say nothing of the kind of hostility in this country generally to investing in the public welfare of non-elites. And then the third one is grassroots financing, which sounds great. How you do it at scale is a difficult question, and how you do it all in the face of rising sea levels and so forth is at the very least, I just want to highlight the trade-offs and the dilemmas of finance and whether or not it's acceptable. And obviously it's not up to me to decide, but folks have to decide whether the trade-off is acceptable, whether the trade-off of relying on the bond market is an acceptable trade-off if it means mobilizing the essential resources to fortify communities in the wake of ecological destruction and in the Anthropocene. So those are some things that I'm thinking about. No answer there, but just to try to sharpen the debate or the discussion around the dilemmas that I think are before us. And and the place of finance. And the last thing I'll say is, people may not know, but you also have folks who in the financial world are very much motivated by, interested in what's described as ESG investing, environmental, social governance investing. It's the idea of screening out entire industries and corporations that are, antithetical to agreed upon environmental, social, and governance standards. The S&G are underdeveloped at this point, but who are trying to think about investing in green energy, a green transition through that framework. Folks say some people would say that that's just the most recent gloss on the pig of predatory system. I don't know. But that is to say that people in the finance world are very much thinking about this. I think it's worth trying to, at the very least, think about the rubrics they use to define risk, to think about what counts as a equitable investment when it comes to social and governance standards. So anyway, thank you for the question. That was really great, and I'm glad I was able to kind of speak to some stuff that's also kind of keeping me up. Well, I'm not sleeping because of my daughter. I'm up because of these these kind of questions.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Dr. Covert, for your question. Dr. Covert and Dr. Dingley both led sessions of the reading group. So they've engaged very deeply with your book, and we thank them for that. Irina, Dr. Giva's question, it crossed a little bit with some of what Dr. Covert just asked, asking about, is there a way to do private-public investment, properly, as in equitably, fairly? Is there a way that this can be done? Do you have, and you spoke to that a little bit just now on the idea of local and federal, or state and local and federal, but is there another way to think about private-public, right, as well? And then she's also asking if there's a way that some of this can be opened up a little bit. So can the press play a role in making these things more public? Are there ways that that we could try to access, if by the time things are on the table, these decisions have been made, what are strategies that could be put in place for trying to get democracy earlier in the system, right? Does the press have a role to play in that? And if so, how? Or are there other ideas of doing that?
Yeah, I love the question. I mean, I think the questions, I kind of already laid out the financing piece, the alternative ones. I mean, I think the last thing I'll just say is public-private partnership, public-private relationships. I just think that the 2 points I'll make on that is the language really matters. Partnerships are not equal, right? And so we're thinking about the discourse, public-private partnership, which perhaps sometimes can assume that there's a symmetry of interest, it's a symbiotic relationship, but we need to think about, what kind of partnership, what are the terms of the partnership? And the second thing is kind of what I had said earlier, is how we historicize public-private partnerships, the sense that this is a kind of post-1970s neoliberal privatization story, and to instead ask, well, what if the history extends much further, goes way back, to see public-private partnerships as actually constitutive of capital and resource development. And so then, are there different inflection points? Are there alternatives from the past that we might draw on? Alternatives perhaps entirely to public-private partnerships, because we're not the first ones to think about the question of how to generate funds, how to raise revenues, how to fund basic infrastructure and services. The other question about the role of the press, this is really great. I feel on this day pretty optimistic. I think that not so well. Let me just say, I think that there's more willingness to engage matters of finance, municipal finance, than at least perhaps in recent memory. I do think there's a willingness to kind of dive into the bowels, to think about and cover the stories of People's Budget LA or other communities who are doing the kind of financial investigative reporting and really forensic accounting even of how cities spend their money. I mean, the clearest example was the idea of divest and invest, right? During the movement for Black Lives, right? That is, yes, there are many different aspects of that particular project, but it rests on an actual empirical examination of how cities spend money and what they spend money on and what they don't spend money on. And actually, taking a step further, who actually foots the bill for, forms of redress, right? So it is a kind of accounting that is the basis of that movement. And the press would be wise to really acknowledge that power of that analysis, right? Not just to see it as, is it politically palatable, is it going to win, but actually to recognize the importance of that financial investigatory work. Now, as far as other ways of kind of deepening or broadening popular awareness, I think that one of the things I've been working on is with the ACLU is the creation of a video essay, right? So not just me delivering a lecture or writing a book or article, but a little 4 to 5 minute video essay in which I kind of offer the history, some of the history of what you heard today, but also adding sound, animation, right? Basically trying to reach people across their different ways of learning beyond just sort of hearing a lecture. And so I think that the Debt Collective and people like Astra Taylor have done wonderful jobs around this to basically try to use video essays, docu shorts and so forth to try to increase the awareness around what appears at first glance to be very dry and boring, but actually, it's quite revelatory. So that's something that I would say any folks working for the local papers is support the video essays of folks who are trying to make sense of this stuff and disseminate it as widely as possible.
That's great. And I love hearing that you have some form of optimism. That's really nice. There is a question in the chat asking you if you could just repeat the name of that political economy piece that you said was so great that everyone should read.
Oh, let me put it in the chat, actually. Let me do that. Will people be able to see if I do it?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Absolutely. And then we have, once you've done that, we do have a question from Dr. Coy. Let you work on that. So Dr. Coy is
okay. I just put the link in the chat. So yeah, sure.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So Dr. Coy is interested in your remarks about the role of the bond market in higher education, which is very interesting and something that's pertinent to many of us. He says, do you think companies like Moody's downgrading the outlook of certain universities or types of universities today shapes the decisions of how administrators in a similar way, similar forces shape the decisions of municipal authorities in mid-century San Francisco? Are there parallels there? And do these financial relationships also foster racial inequalities? Is that something that happens? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I think the dependence on the bond market shapes and affects the kinds of certainly the kinds of real estate, land, and developmental policies. I don't, but the question is always empirical, right? I mean, a certain, if you can think about somebody like Devarian Baldwin's work, he looks at the University of Chicago, Trinity College, and a few other institutions. And so for him, these institutions all are kind of participating in this whole, what's been described as meds and eds, right? Where, thinking about urban transformation through expanding the medical complexes, as well as the educational footprint, new buildings, dorms, nice amenities for the students. And so to what extent is the meds and eds part of the evaluative rubrics of credit rating agencies? So when the leaders of higher education go to meet with these folks or talk to them before issuing a bond measure, is the meds and eds kind of and the nice amenities part of the things that they're looking for, right? Before then thinking about the kinds of ways in which that affects revenues and the ability to pay back bondholders. So I think the short answer is yes. The empirical question is, it depends on an R1, I suppose, a community college, a municipal college. It depends as well on the diversity of the range of funding. So schools that are dependent on tuition, it's going to be different from, for instance, other schools which receive federal funding, far more in federal funding, in terms of, just how the raters are viewing the ability to hit those revenue targets. I would say that, yes, there is absolutely a relationship an important relationship between institutions of higher education and the bond market. I think it does affect or play out in place-based ways in terms of real estate development and local development. But I think that it's a little different, probably. I don't want to say just thinking about the city versus institutions of higher ed, only because the question of democracy and popular input seems to me to be, and the lack thereof, the circumscription of democracy seems to be most sharpest or tightened when we think about cities as supposedly paragons of democracy, where folks are able to speak up. Demographic transformations, migrations disrupt and make what is oftentimes treated as a static entity, the city, when it comes to a bond measure, which is ultimately very dynamic, right? Migrations to and from hurricanes and so forth that then can maybe create new climate refugees, for instance. I'm just thinking out loud here, affect the city in very different ways than I think a university, which has a certain enrollment, right? Enrollment targets, and is far less open, so to speak. So I think the issue of democracy is most pronounced. The problem of democracy is most pronounced when it comes to cities. But yes, I think there is a relationship. I think it's important to investigate between, rating agencies and university officials, college officials as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I do just want to say, for people who may not have access to the chat right now, if you're on a phone or something, that the article title that Dr. Jenkins shared with us was "A Just Transition for Finance" by Mohit Mukim. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that Dr. Dingley, my co-organizer, has a question, and I'd like to turn it over to him for a moment.
Sure. Yeah, I hope that I can turn this into a question. It may just be a kind of an observation and ask you to reflect on it, but it has to do with, maybe it's a methodological question. It has to do with abstraction. On the one hand, it seems like part of the problem that you have identified in the book and your talk is that as far as financial markets are concerned, things like elections or democracy and politics only figures as risk, right? or like uncertainty that has to kind of be quantified in some way, like in the form of a credit rating. So that on the one hand, so the actual substantive political, like concrete political issues get erased, right? It just becomes a question of like, is there going to be a riot? Right? There's that on the one hand. On the other hand, it seems like analytically, as historians or social scientists, there's an important level of abstraction that has to go on in our own work on issues like these, because otherwise, I mean, if the problems of racial inequality and so forth that you've identified are treated concretely, then it's like the level of discussion that we end up at is the what you mentioned is this kind of bourgeois liberal, like individual responsibility issue, and the kind of victim blaming and confusing of reversing of cause and effect. Right, you need some kind of an analysis, like an abstraction from kind of concrete empirical realities. I mean, I thought that I think at the beginning of the book, you posed the kind of thought exercise, thinking of credit raters or this kind of the bondmen as historians, which I thought was interesting, because it's a particular kind of history that they're interested in and that they're producing. So I guess that if I had to funnel this into a question, it would be the question of where does one begin kind of analytically, at what level of conceptual abstraction or concretion? Does it really matter where you start as long as you're able to move analytically between these levels of concretion and abstraction, or quality and quantity?
Yeah, Zeb, a lot there. Let me say something about the first thing you mentioned, where politics only figures as risk and uncertainty. I mean, I think that what's interesting to me about that assertion, not yours, but that is, more or less kind of an assertion from the rating agencies, right? The sense that like the thing that matters most is the risk to investment, the risk to timely payment. Even though that's another arc that the book traces, is how we go from incredible bondholder losses in the 30s to by the 1980s, supreme confidence, right? That's the kind of point about the supremacy of bondholders, the sense that like they're going to get theirs. And even if, they may have to take delay there's a delay in repayment or, a refunding issue, but they're going to get there. So the confidence, right? So what risk is actually involved, I guess is interesting. And it's interesting not because of the risk to delivery of timely payment, but which risks matter, right? So you have the riots, the urban uprisings in the 1960s, which are seen as a major risk because long-term bondholders who have tied up their capital for 20, 30 years may worry, well, is the city going to stand, right? And so you see, interestingly enough, a speculating in riot futures, a move away towards short-term debt, a way to kind of have the best of both worlds, have tax-exempt interest income without tying your capital up in the city that may not stand, which may go by, may burn down. The great quote in the context of San Francisco's uprising is, our famed liberal city may go the way of Watts or Newark, right? The sense that like we may actually not stand and suffer the reputational consequences. So that's politics, right? Politics, right? Black folks engaged in a different form of political behavior, i.e. uprisings, that then is seen as a potent risk to bondholders. But what's very interesting to me is how other kinds of political expressions, and forgive me here, but I have to go here, other kinds of political expressions, for instance, domestic terrorism in this country, white domestic terrorism, doesn't register as a risk. Or how you can have at most the statement from, I think it was Standard & Poor's, say that if this nation does not certify the results of the most recent election and folks do not support a just and peaceful transition, then the credit of the United States may have suffered a downgrade. But there's very little commentary from the credit rating analysts when we see other forms of political behavior that may jeopardize the ability of bondholders to be repaid. And maybe the point there is that actually there is no tension between white supremacy and a nascent fascist movement and delivery of payment to bondholders. Maybe there is no tension, and one could look at the history of Jim Crow and see that actually is the case. Right? You could think about an apartheid regime in the American South, and nevertheless, folks able to get theirs. Okay, where's the tension? But in this particular moment, so only certain kinds of risks, and the risks, only certain kinds of politics rise to the level or get coded as risk. That's a long way of saying. That's a way of summarizing what I just said. And the certain kinds of politics are Black rebelliousness, labor strikes, unionization. I mean, the things that get folded into risk and then become a penalizable offense, whereas other kinds of dictates, executive orders, do not. And so then the question is like, well, what is going on with risk here? Is it actual risk to investors, or is risk another way of basically trying to discipline and contain a kind of political agitation that is seen as outside the boundaries of acceptable politics? And I'm thinking here again of the uprising, strikes, and so forth. So anyway, that's just something to say about risk. I mean, your other question around like how to approach this stuff, I think actually relates to what Shannon had offered in the chat around like how to teach this stuff. I mean, I can tell you my own journey, but I won't bore you on that. What I will just say is like at the end of the book, and what I do in the epilogue is kind of highlight a few stories that, you know, if I had more time, I would pursue. One of them is something that I'm, you know, worked on an article. It's, you know, hopefully will be out, but which thinks about the remarkable campaign of CORE and the NAACP to try to turn off, again, the financing of segregated public education in the American South. They're pressuring regulators in Massachusetts, in Illinois, in Pennsylvania. They're demonstrating outside of the offices of financial institutions. They're launching injunctions in the hope of trying to create a cloud over a bond sale to compel local districts to accelerate desegregation. So that is a long way of saying now when I teach this stuff, I try to begin with the actual analysis, campaigns, and tactical maneuvers of social movements who thought about this stuff a long time ago. And I begin with those primary sources, those actors, those critiques as a way to think about the more larger macro abstract stuff, processes of abstraction. Whereas previously, it was more so me operating with a heavy hand to try to explain, and then only using the kind of primary sources and the material from archival material to kind of elaborate what I thought was happening. Right? You see what I mean? Right? There's a different, the starting point is different now. The starting point is actually beginning with the work of folks engaged in financial activism and what they said, beginning there, as opposed to me kind of beginning with, here's how a bond works. You know, here's what the textbooks say, right? It's important. But the kind of the arc, I guess, maybe the ultimate arc I'm trying to land on is probably the same, but the starting point, the entrees, I guess, are different. And so to Shannon, your question, I think you asked about documents for introducing this topic to students. You know, I actually haven't taught, my book came out in March last year. I was on sabbatical and I haven't taught the book. I did teach a class, Governance Through Debt. And so the ways in which we approach governance through debt, where municipal debt is, you know, a subset of, you know, governance through mortgage finance or debt issued by the World Bank or so on, was, you know, one important source is a film called Life in Debt. And it's really talking about the IMF, World Bank stuff, Global South stuff. But that was we watched that day one, and that opened up questions of not just like debt is what you incur, it's my personal responsibility, but drew attention to the whole point of governance, in particular, racial governance, whether you can then think about Haiti as one of the first examples of racial governance in the age of emancipation, of governance through indebtedness, through the kind of 100-year indemnity imposed on Haiti. But so that was a really important source that I began with. And then, you know, I got to be careful, like, because sometimes I'll go in deep into the municipal finance stuff, and folks are, you know, they'll be okay with it. You know, they'll go along the journey. But, you know, I don't want to get too technical. But the short answer is I actually haven't taught my book. And I haven't really focused too much on municipal bond finance in the classroom. I thought more comparatively across different forms of indebtedness. And might reference the municipal finance stuff here and there. Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to point out here that Dr. Covert has put a comment in the chat that says, I found this quote from your book very provocative. And this came up in more than one of our conversations. Debt payments were sacrosanct, not because keeping the promise to lenders was more honorable than serving people, but because bondholder power was of a greater concern to municipal officials than the outrage of ordinary residents. And she's saying that your response made her think about whose outrage matters. I think that's a really excellent point to think about here as we conclude our discussion. So I guess I would offer you, Dr. Jenkins, a response to make a final comment about that outrage. Where should outrage, where is this outrage directed, and whose outrage matters now, and what, where do you see these sort of parallels to your research, and the really urgent matter of the present. I'll let you make a final comment on that.
Yeah, this is another fantastic question. Whose outrage matters? I think that, as a historian, I think we can kind of think about that question in terms of change over time. And for me, I do think it's interesting that, like, okay, so if we take the bond referenda that were rejected in the 1960s, that I talk about in San Francisco, you have the outrage of many different constituencies. For instance, Black folks who say, look, for 20 years, we've been supporting these bond issues. We've gotten very little in return, trying to boycott bond issues and saying we refuse to support them, and actually helping to torpedo the city's spending priorities. In that sense, at that moment, the city was responsive to that form of outrage, and made some concessions here and there around political appointments. But the following year, and increasingly, they removed popular input entirely, or required far less for a bond issue to be approved. So that was a crucial point, inflection point, where the outrage of the citizenry, the local citizenry, actually mattered. And it was a way to keep officials accountable to try to secure greater investment in the communities. But soon after, that was actually no recourse. That was not the idea of torpedoing a bond issue by way of mobilizing Black political power was no longer an effective pressure point on which to push for Black folks. So that's a long way of saying, okay, my general understanding or interpretation of democracy in the 21st century on this day is that increasingly the outrage of everyday folks, protests in the street matters very little, because one, of money in politics, right? Where elected officials are accountable to those who fund their campaigns. Two, where we see extreme forms of gerrymandering, not just of Black and brown communities, but I would actually say that Black and brown folks are always the canary in the coal mine, rest in peace, Lonnie Guinier, always the canary in the coal mine, in the sense that what was done in the form of gerrymandering to Black folks will soon be done, in my opinion, to poor and working class white folks. There will be no need for their opinion, their thoughts. And so gerrymandering will be applied there. And of course, you can think about the forms of disenfranchisement of the millions of folks incarcerated who served their time, paid their debt to society, there goes debt again, but who can no longer vote. So whose outrage matters is only, get in the context of extreme money in politics, the donors. That is, a kind of maybe a materialist and perhaps too crude interpretation of the outrage that matters. It's not folks who may vote them out of office, because I think there's very little fear of being voted out of office because folks lived in protected districts. They can outfund and outraise the next person. And if they lose, they have a plum job, a golden parachute onto the next position. So it's a great question. Whose outrage matters? That's my take on it now. But I do think that outrage and the response to outrage changes over time. So what is perhaps true now, or at least this could be an important source for discussion and debate as we're having now, was not true in the 1960s and the 1890s and so on. So that's just me thinking out loud there. It's not very optimistic, an optimistic note to end on. Yeah.
This was so stimulating, and I just want to thank you so much for sharing with us, and I want to thank all of you for coming. And I want to ask our chair of the department, Dr. Jason Coy, to close our program. And again, thank you to all of you.
Yeah, let
Well,
me
thank
just real quick, Jason, I just want to thank you guys so much. Again, like to go back to the incredible efforts happening at the College of Charleston, folks who are just putting it on the line. You know, just it's a great honor to be a part of that, to deliver this lecture. It's my first such invitation, so it means a great deal to me. So thank you very much. And, you know, hopefully I've offered something to help y'all in your local struggles moving forward. Sorry, Jason.
Well, no, thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. And we don't want to keep you too long because you probably have a toddler that's getting very hungry and ready for you to be out of this lecture. But I just wanted to say on behalf of the Department of History, we're very proud to have hosted you today, and we want to thank you certainly for the lecture. I also want to thank Dr. Jones and Dr. Dingley for their hard work in putting this program together. I want to thank Dean Gibbs-Knotts for his introductory remarks and for his support for this lecture series, and also for the department's larger efforts in the area of diversity and equity. I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Center for Sustainable Development, our audience for their attention and their questions. But finally, most importantly, I want to thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for taking the time to really introduce this fascinating topic to us. I mean, I for one, I'll never look at things that I thought were mundane and everyday, like, you know, urban renewal and bond markets and things like that in the same way again. I mean, you've totally convinced me. You've taken something that seems dry and seems like it could be dull or inconsequential, and I think you make such a compelling point that this really is at the heart of American urban politics and American society and racial inequities in our country today. So I just want to thank you for bringing your insights to us today.
Wow, Jason, that is the highest form of praise. It really is to have folks appreciate the work and to see, you know, to see differently. You know, we all may disagree around solutions. Heck, I disagree sometimes myself and debate myself around, you know, alternatives left and right. But to, you know, offer, as I think the book tried to do, a way of seeing and approaching the mundane, the things we take for granted, and for y'all to agree that actually there's a whole lot more there, it means a great deal. So thank you very much for acknowledging that. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and best luck with the book and with the rest of your endeavors.
Thank you. Same to y'all. Everybody take care. Enjoy the weather.
Everybody, thank you so much.